Welcome, everybody. We're here at a panel to honor R.A. Christmas, or Bob Christmas, or Hank, as different people will call him at different times, for his career in poetry and fiction and criticism and all the great work he's done for so many years in his literary work. So my name is Andrew Hall, and I'm the awards chair for the Association for Mormon Letters. And every year the association picks 2 lifetime awardees, and the decision is made by the AML board and all the judges who are judging awards that year. So about 25 people. They all put in their own ideas for who should get the award that year, and this year it was overwhelming. That was the first choice that R.A. Christmas should get the award. So I'm so excited to have lots of people here with us to honor Bob Christmas. We have Bob Rees, Clifton Jolley, Bruce W. Jorgensen, Harlow Clark, and Tyler Chadwick are on the panel. We might have Dennis Clark coming in later on, we'll see. And also several members of Bob Christmas's family and other friends are here. So we're going to start with Bob Rees is going to read the award citation that he and Clifton Jolley wrote. So Bob, go ahead.
Contemporary Mormon literature likely was not what Orson F. Whitley had in mind when he predicted in 1888 that Mormon literature, in his article Mormon Literature, that, quote, "We will yet have Miltons and Shakespeares of our own. God's brightest spirits are held in reserve for the latter times. In God's name and by his help, we will build up a literature whose top shall touch the heaven, though its foundations may now be low on earth." While Mormon literature has not yet reached the Parnassian pinnacle Elder Whitney foresaw, the variety and richness of Mormon literature that flourishes in this early part of the 21st century certainly affirms the strength of its earthly foundation. That strength is reflected in the range and richness of Robert Christmas's literary expressions over the past half-century. By virtue of his poetry, fiction, criticism, and most recently, musical drama, Robert Christmas has more than earned the 2000 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Mormon Letters. Bob is an accomplished poet with a distinctive Mormon voice. In fact, one might argue that it is the most consistently Mormon, as opposed to Latter-day Saint voice, of any of the poets of his generation. It is hard to think of a Christmas poem that isn't in one way or another Mormon. He writes about Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, polygamous women, fundamentalists, John D. Lee, among others, and about tithing, temples, sacrament meetings, missionary work, and just about every other Mormon subject one can think of. While keeping at least one eye on the celestial kingdom, Christmas's personae seem to be most comfortable from the vantage point of the celestial, which is, after all, a much richer vein for mining literature that speaks to real Latter-day Saints. As he says in Ecclesiastical Correctness, one of his most recent poems, the Mormon Church calls its members saints and would settle for being called the Church of Jesus Christ, but that sounds too exclusive, and as for saints, face it, that's a stretch. Bob's most recent collection of poetry, Leaves of Sass, shows his characteristic poetic proficiency, wit, and comic irony. Like Walt Whitman, who sang his barbaric yawp over the cities, mountains, and plains of America, Christmas's yawp, which he denigrates by calling it a chirp, his song of himself, floats over the homes, chapels, and temple spires of the Mormon landscape. Robert Frost said he had a lover's quarrel with the world. The same could be said of Bob's relationship with the church, although his quarrel is more like that of the English metaphysical poets who tended to play hob with holy things, but always with a love and reverence for the holy. For example, in Song of Himself, Christmas responds to a promise from the temple ceremony about being anointed to become a king and a priest unto the Most High God with, "Really?" only to follow it with, "This is a promise worth repeating and worth printing here, anywhere. It's almost too good to be true." Bob's poetry is both brilliant and brilliantly, if often shockingly, honest, especially when he writes obliquely about himself. He comes to vices, major and minor, and opens his personal story like the pages of the National Enquirer, although unlike traditional confessional poets, his eye is a slightly distanced he. Hidden behind one of Christmas's favorite personae, known as Hank, is a kind of cowboy poet. He is behind that personae is a skilled craftsman with degrees from Stanford, Berkeley, and the University of Southern California. Bob Christmas is also a gifted writer of fiction. Like his poems, his stories reveal a decidedly Mormon mind, one that struggles with temptation, sin, obedience, backsliding, repentance, resolve to be better, etc. In other words, the life of an ordinary, believing, doubting, and aspiring saint. One reviewer of his fiction refers to Christmas as a disruptive, creative writer, which could be said of any writer worth our reading. If the characters and scenes and predicaments of his stories are of a time, they are also outside of time, which is why future generations of Latter-day Saints and those seeking to understand late 20th and early 21st century world of this decidedly American religious folk will find them timeless. Bob's most recent literary oeuvre is a Carol Christmas musical V. That's not a misprint. His love song to his late wife, Carol. If nothing else, this experimental musical reveals that Bob Christmas could easily have been at home in Nashville. At home, he could have been a star with songs like Hot Flashes and Cold Kisses, Throwing Stones, Spending Another Sunday with the Blues, It's Over and I'm Gone Under, and You Are Everything Called Love. Like other of Bob's literary works, A Carol Christmas reveals Bob's characteristic brilliance in creating interesting characters and keeping an emotional distance with wit and irony. But it also reveals a heart softened by pain and loss, and an awareness that although love in a Mormon heart ends up in heaven, it begins on earth. In Birches, Robert Frost says, "Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better." He imagines getting away from earth for a while by climbing a birch tree toward heaven till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. And Frost says, that would be good, both going and coming back. Robert Christmas's art is grounded on earth, but in his musical, he reveals it can also touch heaven. You're muted.
I am. You're right. Thank you very much. Okay, Bob Rees, would you like to say anything else, or shall we move on?
Well, Bob and I go back a very long way. It goes back before he knew that I kind of fell in love with his writing when I got that first issue of Dialogue and saw this wonderful article on Parley P. Pratt, who was one of my favorite Mormon writers. And I thought, this is someone paying attention to. And so Bob and I can't remember exactly when we first met, but we became friends when I was involved in running a writer's program, among other things, at UCLA, and invited Bob to come and teach. And I think he also took a songwriting class through UCLA Extension. Is that right, Bob?
Yes. Bob and I go back a long time. I'll have to mention this, although I mentioned in my closing remarks. Bob is responsible for my whole mini career as a wannabe singer-songwriter in Hollywood in the 70s and 80s. I was broke, and he enabled me as the dean of extension at UCLA to take classes for free. So I studied with Academy Award winner Al Kasha, Buddy Kay, a great Tin Pan Alley writer, and I learned everything I needed to know, so to speak. I'm still, my goal is still to be a one-hit wonder. But in this, on this, Doug Cox, down there, is my childhood singer-songwriter friend, and Doug had the #2 country song in America for several weeks, sung by Bobby Goldsboro. Doug wrote a thing called A Butterfly for Bucky, and I think Bobby Goldsboro's wife pulled it out of the trash. Bobby said, he threw it in the trash. Bobby Goldsboro's wife pulled it out of the trash. Bobby recorded it, and it was second to, remember C.B. McCall and The Convoy? That was a huge hit, and Doug was second, and he would have been first if it wasn't for C.B. McCall. So that's just a great story about being Doug. I'm digressing, but it's a great story. Doug, we're so glad to have you here. You had
honored to be with you, brother.
Okay, back to where we were, wherever you want to go.
Okay, how about we go? I see Dennis Clark is here now too. Welcome, Dennis.
Can you put up your things and have?
Well, I don't know if I'm really that welcome, but here I am.
Let's go to, how about Clifton? Would you like to go next?
What's the deal? Yeah.
Cliff, you're muted.
Yeah, I know.
Unmute.
My
Now you're not.
wife does that to me all the time. So I'm reminded, Bob called me up and asked me if I would write a blurb for his book. And I did. And he's not only a fine writer for himself, he writes pretty well for me too. Because when he sent the blurb back to me, it had nothing at all to do with what I'd actually written. But it was something that I wished that I had written, so it was fun. I came to Bob Christmas late in life because, I grew up in Southern California, and it wasn't until Dialogue was first published that I realized there was an intellectual community of writers and researchers and academics and lay people, and Bob was among those. And I first read one of his poems and then 2 of his short stories. And Gene England told me that he was one of the most gifted writers in Mormon culture. And I told Gene, I said, well, I don't see it. And Gene told me, he said, I remember, he seldom criticized. And so instead of criticizing me, he said, well, he is artless in his approach. And so of course you would have some difficulty understanding it. And that's probably as good an explanation of the kind of clever rhetoric that he manages to dredge out of himself in ways that are mysterious to me and true. And true primarily because he has the voice of, I know some writers are said to have the voice of angels. If Bob Christmas's voice is the voice of angels, they're very strange angels indeed, because Bob's voice is that of not only an observer, but I think of a critical observer. I once told Gene, I said, as long as Bob Christmas and Carl Keller are alive, I'll never be the most offensive person in the room. And I think that his literature, had Orson F. Whitney been told, had he been a prophet, in fact, with that statement about Milton's and Shakespeare's of our own. And he had been able to look forward and realize that one of our Miltons and Shakespeare's would be Bob Christmas. He would have said, never mind, we'll make bankers and attorneys. They're less trouble. And yet, nevertheless, in terms of his language, it is as true to his people and his culture as Shakespeare was true to the folks who couldn't afford seats at the Globe and were eating fruit and standing in the mosh pit. As true as that language is, and as artful as it is, Bob gives a fine representation of who we are. And it's not simply what he writes about, but it's the voice in which he writes, which reminds me of the voice of my uncles and my great-grandfather, those first Mormons that I ever knew, and realized that I would never speak so cleverly nor so entertainingly as they did, having grown up differently. So we're fortunate not only to have had Bob Christmas, but that he has lasted so long. Bob Rees and Bob Christmas, will they never die? Let us hope not. Certainly their literature won't. Thank you.
Thanks, Clifton.
Thank you, Bob. Oh, and before this is done, I want to read what I actually wrote for the book, because it's the only way it will ever see the light of day. Thank you, Bob.
Sorry.
No.
Hey, Bob Christmas, can I ask, so you were in the very first issue of Dialogue, and you've been published in Dialogue, throughout your whole career. How did you get connected with Gene England and the editors of that very first issue?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I can take a page from my little lasting remarks. I'm going to quickly read, then I can skip over it at the end. Because we have Jim Mcmichael on board, and James Mcmichael is the way I got connected with Gene. Okay, here we go. Jim, I hope you'll forgive me. Oh, there you are. Okay, so here we go. My high school friend, James Mcmichael, and I wrote poetry and listened to a lot of jazz together. Jim went on to a career teaching English at UC Irvine and has published several books of poetry and criticism. He has national recognition. A few years back, he was nominated for the National Book Award in Poetry. He should have won. Jim and Gene England became friends in grad school at Stanford. It was through Jim that I became acquainted with Gene. I sent a poem to Jim in the 60s called To Joseph Smith. Jim shared it with Gene because he knew Gene was a Mormon. And after Gene read it, he said this to Jim: "Who is this guy?" And that's how I ended up in Dialogue. Although the first version of the poem was published in BYU Studies. A year or so before Gene passed away, the three of us went fishing on a weekend at Henry's Fork at Island Park, Idaho, where Jim has a cabin. Gene and Jim hadn't had contact for a number of years, and I had never been with them together. It was a beautiful thing to see them locked in conversation again on that gorgeous riverside. I left them at it, fished by myself, and caught nothing but a precious memory. Hi, Jim and Susan. So glad to see you. Anyway, that's how I met Gene England. And I'm the only person who ever defeated Jim in 21 backyard basketball in his court at his home. I'm the only one that ever did it, and there were a lot of them who tried. End of story.
How about Tyler? Would you like to go next?
Sure, I can do that. You hear me all right?
Yes.
You bet.
All right, so I've been thinking about Bob's career, what little I know for the little that I've been around of it. I helped Bob edit his book, Saviors on Mount Disneyland. It was a really great introduction to his process, to the things that he likes to talk about and his approach. Because I'll be honest, the first time I encountered a Bob Christmas poem, I was just like, what is this? I don't know what this guy's doing. This isn't highfalutin enough. This isn't poetry. This is just conversation. But I've since come to understand the beautiful poetry that is within that, the conversational nature of his work. And so to sort of celebrate and honor him, I wanted to look at one poem that I came across as I was scouring through dialogue recently. It's called Liahona. And I think it's pretty prescient, apropos for our time, actually. So I'm just going to read that really quick, and then I'll talk about it for a minute, because it touches on a lot of the things that I find really important. The things that I find moving through Bob's work. So here, Liahona. It's from the summer 2003 issue of Dialogue. After he was let go, Dad's job was changing the rolls on those little spindles in the bathrooms. Almost every morning he'd arise and find the spindles blank or in fragments on the floor, the rolls on the counters. It was curious unworkmanship, how neither his wife nor children ever paid any attention to the restoration of toilet paper or anything that might give them a sense of direction like he had by faithfully attending to the way the spindles worked, by the opposition of the springs, which always, even when all else failed, indicated where he should go and what he should do. And he did. When I first read this, I thought, wow, did he write this yesterday? Because of everything that's been going on kind of in the era of COVID-19. Toilet paper has taken on a whole new meaning and significance. But as I was thinking about this, I kept thinking of the notion of the poet as prophet, which has been around for a long time. Now, as I read Bob's work, he plays with, he parodies, he satirizes, and he critiques this notion of a highfalutin poet's voice, the prophetic voice, and he brings it into the vernacular. So he's a poet, a prophet for and of the people in my mind. And as he's doing this, he let me put this in air quotes. He preaches the banality of the sacred and the holiness of the banal. Because if there's, as we've kind of, I think thinking about it, there's nothing less banal than toilet paper. It does the dirty work in the house, pun totally intended. But I think exploring the father working with the toilet paper, he leaves his old job, and now his job in the home is to take care of the toilet paper, which he might have considered and which many families might consider non-essential work. But I think in the era of COVID-19, we recognize that, there's a lot of the things that we once considered non-essential, they're essential now. Like toilet paper. We need it every day. A house without toilet paper, there could be some problems there. But in this, I love how he holds up kind of Nephi's exploration of his father, his exaltation of his father, and the poet's exaltation of his father. In both stories, there's a separation that starts it off in the beginning. And Lehi Dad leaves his homeland and has to go into the wilderness, which is a yucky place to live. And the poet's dad has to leave his job, and he's stuck really with the essential work of taking care of the toilet paper, which, here comes another pun, is totally in honor of Bob, is a pretty crappy job. But by faithfully attending to that work, and the father, I think, teaches the son something, and by faithfully attending to what the father did, the poet teaches us something about what it means to participate in the quote-unquote non-essential work in the home. And the quote-unquote non-essential work of being a poet. Poets matter. They're essential to our society. They're vital to, well, what makes a living, breathing community. We need our poets because they poke at things and they push at things and they're disruptive. Poets are always about making trouble. Shakespeare, all he did was make trouble. He was bawdy, and all of those things. He celebrated the banal. And I see that running through Bob's work, his celebration of the banal, the holiness of the banal, and the banality of the sacred, which is also, to bring it back to Mormonism, what Joseph Smith did. He brought the heavens and the earth together, and he showed us that there's a banal aspect to the sacred that holds us here, that mirrors heaven and earth, and that work, I think, will continue. Maybe not changing the toilet paper roll so much, but we need to celebrate those essential, non-essential things, including the work of our poets. So here's to you, Bob. Thanks for lighting our way, leading us through our toilet paper crisis.
Thank you, Tyler. Hey, guess what? The poem is written in the third person. I'm the dad in that poem, and I'm still doing it. My kids are sitting here laughing. I'm the only one in the family that knows how to put the spindles together and isn't afraid of them. It's crazy.
That's right. Yeah.
Nothing changes.
Hilarious.
And by the way, thank you for doing that. Tyler did a wonderful job on the cover on Saviors on Mount Disneyland. He is the cover designer on that book. And again, I can't thank you enough. Thanks, Tyler.
My pleasure, Bob.
Onward.
Okay, thank you very much. Bruce, would you like to go next?
Yeah, that'd be okay. Except, I really want to hear what Clifton originally wrote, because I think we got the Christmas.
What book was it? What book was it, Clifton?
It was for the fiction.
Oh, it's in the fiction. I don't have that right. Do you want me to read it?
No, I want to hear what
I
Clifton
said.
Not just Bob Christmas who rejected it. When he didn't use it, and Bob Rees and I were asked to do this introduction, I
Go
sent
into
it
my
to
room.
Bob.
The upper part of the
And Bob
bookcase,
didn't
the
use it either.
fiction. It's on the left at the top in my
And
bookcase.
so everything that you heard in Bob saying, that's Bob's. And so I'll send it to you, Bruce. I'm
Okay.
beginning to think nobody actually needs to hear it
Okay.
because some of the better writers I know have already rejected it.
Okay. All right. Well, I actually spent a good part of the day writing a little text here, and I'm going to read it. That was when I wasn't fighting dandelions. Sometimes I mentally play the degrees of separation game. And now I know that thanks to my association with Bob Christmas, going back to Cedar City, Utah in 1968, when we were colleagues at the College of Southern Utah, which soon became Southern Utah State College, about the same time he became my chairman in its minuscule English department, consisting of 4 full-time faculty and about the same number of adjuncts whom I supervised as director of comp. I am about 3 or 4 degrees from Elvis, the Beatles, and Paul Robeson. This is thanks to Doug Cox. Even way back then, I knew I was also, by way of Bob, just 2 degrees from the poets and critics Ivor Winters and James Mcmichael. And I'm so pleased to see the face of James Mcmichael this evening, or the image thereof. But, we'd not even heard about degrees of separation back then. I was 2 degrees from Winters also by way of Doug Thayer, and 2 degrees from Winters and Mcmichael by way of Gene England, and I think by way of the novelist and scholar critic Dan McCall at Cornell, who once, about 1985 or 86, told me he'd broken a finger on Bob's skull because Winters was a boxing aficionado and encouraged his students to get into the ring. Footnote on that, I think it was Bob who prompted me to read Leonard Gardner's Fat City. which after a recent rereading, I still suspect might be the best novel ever written about boxing. At any rate, it's hard for me to imagine a better one. Much more significant to me than those degrees of separation. I mean, after all, that second degree is rather often an impassable gulf, is that Bob introduced me to Winters's work, especially In Defense of Reason, Forms of Discovery, and the essay, The Audible Reading of Poetry, which I've never gotten over and do not wish to get over. The same with James Mcmichael's elegant, slender book, The Style of the Short Poem. The same again with some poems and especially some essays by J.V. Cunningham, like The Journal of John Cardan, The Quest of the Opal, The Problem of Form, and How Shall the Poem Be Written? After and despite all I'd been learning of and about poems at BYU and Cornell, I count those as the real start of my still incomplete education in how poets compose poems and how readers might best read them. It was in Cedar City, 1968 to 71, and under the influence of Bob and of Winters, Cunningham, and Michael, spurred also by hearing Bill Stafford read and talking with him, that I wrote the earliest poems of my own that I can still feel okay to read. I'd written a few in high school and college, and they were about as bad as you'd figure they would be, and I trust that they are now as lost and gone forever as my darling Clementine. The ones I wrote at SUSC were the first I published, and I think I can still stand by them, as if I had a choice. It was also under those influences that I wrote and published in Dialogue my first essay in Mormon literary criticism, Imperceptive Hands, Some Recent Mormon Verse, which began as a book review and got out of hand, as writing tends to do. And this piece is an illustration of that also. Anyway, I think it was Bob Rees editing Dialogue at that time who actually dared to publish that thing. One implication of all this possibly self-indulgent reminiscence is that notwithstanding Orson F. Whitney's exhortation that above all things we must be original, Mormon literary culture and history never have been and never will or should be isolated and disconnected from the wider literary culture, historical and contemporary, of America and the world, folk and pop culture included, if there is any genuine folk culture left. And there are times when you can doubt that. One phase of Bob's career, or perhaps I should say his string of variegated literary enterprises, that I knew very little about until this week, is that 10 years he spent as a wannabe singer-songwriter in Hollywood and environs. And this was not his day job, I should emphasize. By the way, Tolstoy thought no artist should do art for a day job. He judged that professionalization, along with art schools and art criticism, had corrupted art. We should all reread Tolstoy. I've been getting into the lyrics and music that Bob gathered some years ago. I don't know what year, the copyright notice doesn't say, in that collection, Body and Soul, which landed in my mailbox just a couple days ago. Too late for me to have any hope of learning to play and sing any of its songs. But I'll yield to the temptation of quoting some lines from Ain't Got Nothing But a Song that appear on the back cover of this spiral-bound book. And when my maker calls me over to the other side and says, Bobby, are you humble? Are you stripped of pride? I'll say, Lord, that ain't the half of it. It's tragic, but it's true. I tried to be a sinner, seemed like the thing to do, but every sin I grabbed at just sort of slipped away. I'm naked as a jaybird, flying home to Judgment Day. You're welcome to what's left of me, good, bad, right or wrong, 'cause Lord, I ain't got nothing, I ain't got nothing, I ain't got nothing but a song. I've tried writing folky country lyrics too, and it isn't easy. Well, if that teaser or trailer doesn't draw you in, maybe nothing can. But you might take my word for it that the autobiographical introduction to body and soul, 18 single-space pages, and the acknowledgments are worth your ticket price. I did know Bob had helped Tom Cheney collect Mormon songs in southern Utah, but I didn't know how much he felt indebted to the Mormon folk singer L.M. Hilton, who turns up right after Cheney in acknowledgments. Just this week, streaming music on Amazon Prime to kind of, it's part of my regimen during the COVID isolation, but I do it at other times as well. Well, I stumbled on Hilton's pitch-perfect, unaccompanied solo performance of Zach the Mormon Engineer in an album titled The Classic Railroad Songs. Now, I know only a few of those songs, maybe 3 total. And though I still have my old Rosalie Sorrell's LP that includes Zach, I've never learned to sing it, and I may have to mend my ways. Bob calls it the only song I know of that's about Mormon polygamy. It might be. And he says that he sang Zach every chance he got while he was a student at Stanford until he was commanded to cease and desist by his stake president, later an apostle. In a parenthesis, Bob adds, I obeyed, but there's no forgetting this one. He's right about that. And by the way, that anecdote encapsulates or epitomizes a good deal of Mormon cultural history. It's sort of a parable with lessons for us all. I like to think that since the song says its story is true, and Zach worked on the Denver and Rio Grande, and yes, the song says it that way, and we did. One of Zach's many station stop wives lived in my hometown, Salina. The DNRG still ran through there and stopped to deliver a big, heavy-bodied, narrow-necked, flat-top cutaway guitar that I had ordered from Montgomery Ward. And later, a 6-inch reflecting telescope from Edmund Scientific when I was a kid and knew nothing about polygamy despite having 2 polygamous great-grandfathers, at least one of whom did time in Sugar House Prison for it. Which might bring me in this rambling way to another of Bob's self-published books, The Fiction, over which polygamy casts its ever-lengthening shadow. But I wanted first to recommend Leaves of Sass, poems you'd guess, and you'd be right. Truth in advertising, this is not much like Whitman's Leaves of Grass that just kept growing the longer Walt lived and wrote. I'd sort of hoped Leaves of Sass might be like that when I ordered it from Lulu. Accumulation of Bob's poems from all the way back in the 60s till 2019. It does have that copyright date. But no, looks like I'll have to order the earlier collection so I can search out and reread that early Winters inflected stuff. Poems like To Joseph Smith, which has already been mentioned. It's Bob's emulation of Ben Jonson from studying and studying and studying Ben Jonson. And Clifton, that's part of where that ear for language comes from, I think, is poets of the Renaissance, not only Shakespeare, but Jonson. Or the one addressed to Bill Stafford and published in the Southern Review, Driving Without Lights, that I sometimes gave my writing students to read alongside Traveling Through the Dark. Anyway, get Leaves of Sass and browse, graze. Be advised that some, maybe a lot of these leaves are of rye. Some are going to break your heart if it's not too hard and you let them. And beware the dog. Taking up the fiction, I remind myself that it's also thanks to Bob that I've been just 2 degrees separated from the fiction writer and essayist Herbert Gold, of whose work I read too little way back when. Really only the essays in a book titled The Age of Happy Problems. That's a title that presently rouses a deep and painful nostalgia. I started just last week to make up for neglecting Gold with The Man Who Was Not With It. I sort of think the fiction should have been titled, and I said this in my draft of a blurb for the book, should have been titled or parenthetically subtitled The Rick Robinson Papers. and may be edited by a team of assiduous and meticulous scholars, none of them, mind you, as fanatically single-minded or is it many-minded as that Charles Kinbote who edited John Shade's 999-line masterwork. Nabokov's Pale Fire is another book Bob admired back in the late 60s, but alas, I seem still incapable of reading that, though I do keep it at hand, just in case I should suddenly feel and actually be up to it. Full disclosure, and I've already let this cat out of the bag. At Bob's request, I blurbed the fiction for him and Lulu, but I ended up cutting a lot from my notes. Bob cut a lot for me, and I cut and tinkered in the first draft that I wrote of that blurb. So I think it's okay for me to say a bit more about the book, and I'll soon be done. Some readers, before they get many pages in, might back out and pun on the author's name, Raw Christmas. That'd be fair enough, for the pieces fairly often do get down to the grit, grind, grunge, and grime that has been Mormon experience in the late 20th century for more than a few of us. And keep in mind, right now, or recently at least 2/3 of us are converts, as Bob was and as his character Rick Robinson is. And it can't be any easier now than it was then, only different in some ways. To paraphrase a favorite Sesame Street Muppet, it's not that easy being Mormon. Being married, staying married, raising kids, going to church, being a neighbor, holding the priesthood, holding on to the iron rod, learning to read the Liahona, for goodness sake, etc., etc., etc. But it'd also be risky to suppose the book, I don't want to call it a novel, though you may if you wish, nor just a collection, since it's something more than that. It'd be risky to suppose the book is just raw Christmas, despite the many tantalizing or teasing parallels or coincidences that a reader of that autobiographical introduction to Body and Soul might notice in it. Yes, Rick Robinson does look like a surrogate or alter ego of his author, but we'll never know in this life. And I doubt, the Lord being just and merciful, we'll know in the next just how much or how little Rick resembles Robert A. And if we're just and merciful, we may not care to. In fact, a reader might do well to suspect that Rick is the author of all the pieces in the book. It is, after all, his misspent life that the pieces are about, even when, as in Pancha Loca, another character focalizes. There's a technical term for everybody. And after all, R.A. Christmas, the author, or is he Rick's editor, did, and I presume still does, admire Nabokov, than whom I think there has been no trickier writer ever. As I said, parenthetically subtitle the fiction, The Rick Robinson Papers. Read it as a sort of fragmentary archive. Stay alert to Tricky Ricky. Watch out for when he might just be making it up for the sake of the story. It might as well be part of your fun. And that's a word, by the way, that Henry James was not embarrassed to use. As I said in my blurb, it's not romance and not proper. If that genre, so persistently promoted in these latter days by Deseret Book, is your cup of tea, literarily speaking, your way of taking a little break from seeking out of the best books words of wisdom, you're not likely an implied reader of the fiction by R.A. Christmas. Still, you might turn into one if you gave it a shot. Why not just try the first page and see if you feel like going on in? I'm going to read just part of the page from the first section, The Golden Questions. Rick Robinson's conversion to Mormonism began the night of his high school graduation prom in 1957. His date that evening was a young lady, newly arrived from Utah, that he'd met in senior English class. And the first thing she did after they settled in Rick's 46 Chevy coupe was to slide over and give him the most surprising kiss of his life before he even turned the key. "I'm so sorry," she burst out as they came apart. "You're the first non-Mormon boy I've ever kissed. I just had to see what it was like." Then she kissed him again, harder. But after that, she fell back against the seat with eyes closed and chin down. It puzzled Rick to see her so instantly dejected. "You probably think I'm the most forward person in the world," she moaned. "No, I don't," he said, flabbergasted. The pros and cons of kissing on the first date were hotly debated at school, but 2 kisses before a first date even got started, that was something. Rick's imagination boggled with possibilities, but the girl, her name was Karma, just sat looking remorseful, her white crinoline like a giant blossom threatening his dashboard. "Now you'll never accept the church," she said mournfully. "You'll probably think all Mormon girls are like me." "No, I won't," Rick protested. He didn't know any other Mormon girls or what she was talking about. "This," he said to himself, "is going to be the best or the worst date I've ever had." I rest my case. Sorry if that
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. Harlow, would you like to go next?
Unmute myself there. Okay, so I've written already about my first encounter with this strange thing. I mean, who is named R.A. Christmas, who publishes a poem with a historical photo documenting it, and so on. I seem out of confusion notwithstanding. I've had an interesting encounter with Bob's work. I did run into him one day at Desert Industries in Provo. He had sent me a copy of Driving on the Lake Bed to review, and I noticed that a lot of the poems end with a kind of punchline. For example, one called Hope Houses. The last line is, "Utah was once full of hope," and then on the last line, "houses." I mentioned this to him. He was looking at records, and he said, "Yes, that's because I'm a student of 1950s concept albums, and the songs end that way." So I have that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the fiction, and to get into that, I'll tell you a story about my parents. My father turned 19 right at the height of the Great Depression, and was not able to serve a mission. He and my mother always planned to do so after he retired, but in 1978, he was called as a high counselor for BYU Stake, and then in 1979, he was called as the bishop of the ward he'd been counseling. And the stake presidency called him, served out their term. The next stake presidency served out their term, and he was talking to his new stake president, Robert Rees, one day, and noted that he'd been in office for 10 years, and President Matthews released him. By which time he was 73, my mother was 70, and whoever does the thinking about such things thought that they were a little old to go on a mission. However, the Kennedy Center did not think they were too old and asked them if they would go to China and teach as a very, very preliminary step towards possibly getting missionaries into China one day. And there was something of a novelty in a country where most people retire at 55. Here these two people in their 70s. So after he died, after my father died, a year or two afterwards, there was a China teachers reunion at the Rock Chapel on 700 North and 600 East in Provo. And I'll mention that that chapel is a twin to the chapel behind the MTC. And we were driving past that chapel one day. My father pointed out and says, I did the mason work. I did the stonework at that part of the chapel back when members of the church still work on chapels. Anyway, we were in this chapel on 700 North and 600 East, and I wandered out into the foyer at one point. I was looking at the case showing missionaries, and there I see this familiar face. This is Elder Robert and Sister Carol Christmas, Geneva, Switzerland Mission. So I wasn't at all surprised when I got a copy of the expanded version of the fiction to see that the last story takes place on a train going from Geneva, Switzerland to Paris. That is a remarkable story. It is a remarkable story in a lot of ways. And I'll just give you an example. Bruce was reading from Golden Questions, this story that Tran Grand Vitesse returns to that. It returns, the Golden Questions is, it's a conversion story, straightforward conversion story, not a great deal of irony to undercut the story. And the last story returns to that, which is really interesting. The first shorter version of the fiction ended with a really ambiguous note where Robinson says, "I'm just a Methodist boy who got sidetracked." And the later version of it says, "I'm sidetracked again and again." Very ambiguous, and it ends in this this trauma that you've seen from Panchaloka and another angel. You've got this spiritual and emotional trauma that sort of ends the story. But here in the later version, you have this story that is about healing from spiritual and physical and emotional trauma, and very moving in that respect. I should mention, by the way, that Another Angel is one of my favorite stories alongside Levi Peterson's The Gift, because it stands on its head the old idea of the absurdity of life suddenly challenging someone's faith, and the faith crumbles. In these two stories, it goes the other way around. An encounter with faith causes people's sense of the absurd to crumble or to feel deeply challenged. But the Tran Grand Vitesse, while Another Angel has a cerebral place for me, the other story feels much more like a sense of healing, and it's quite remarkable in that regard. And I won't say anything about the last story in the book, which is called The Kingdom or Nothing, an alternative history. Excuse me. Except that it is, I've always considered that was maybe Robinson's unmasking of his self. He talks somewhat about not being able to write, not being able to do any creative work. And so this last story feels like it is his work, his creative endeavor. A very interesting story, and right at the end of it, it feels completely unrelated to everything in the book before, but right at the end, all the themes come together. Quite remarkable. And then I started reading Saviors on Mount Disneyland, and the first poem sounds like it's a direct address to readers who have just been reading Rick Robinson's work. So, very good stuff. I quite quite pleased to see it, quite pleased to see it not in a blue cyanosis cover or the little blue book or the little book that you keep hidden, but something that feels accessible and says, yeah, you got it.
All right.
Thanks, Harlow. Thank you, bud.
Thanks, Bob. Good work.
Dennis, would you like to go next?
Yes. This is the back cover of Leaves of Sass.
Look out. Look out.
That is my favorite portrait of R.A. Christmas. And the reason it is that that is his Doc Holliday persona. Now you may wonder, who is Doc Holliday? You can only wonder that if you haven't read Saviors on Mount Zion. There we go. Because in Saviors on Mount Zion, Bob turns about as serious as he ever has been. My first contact with Bob goes all the way back to dialogue as well. It was a pun. He wrote about a new book that had been published on the Mormons and blacks, and it was called, wait for it, A Marvelous Shirk and a Blunder. Now, Bob may disown that pun, but I don't think so. So I have always appreciated Bob's ability to pun on something like Counting the Costco, which is another one of his poems. But throughout Saviors on Mount Disneyland, scattered throughout, there are 10 poems called Bunkhouse Poetics. And the Bunkhouse Poetics are attributed in a later email to Doc Holliday. And once again, that's Doc Holliday.
It's Hank Holiday, buddy.
No, it's Doc Holliday. You can tell me it's Hank Holiday, but I know the real truth. These are the only poems I know of Bob's that are as serious as he ever gets. And what they are is 10 poems for young Mormon poets. So I shouldn't pay any attention to them, but I did anyway. He talks about what it means to write poetry. I have read these at an open mic in Provo, the one held at Enlightened Bakery, called Speak for Yourself, on more than one occasion. Most of the young poets there don't care. That's one of the problems that Bob identifies. I'm going to read 2 of these poems to give you some sense of what Hank Holiday and his persona is. Bob, Doc Holliday, really talks about. This is called Bunkhouse Poetics 9. Since there are 10 of them, this is the next to last. All of them begin with an epigram. This is the only one that comes from Scripture. And the Lord said unto me, these 2 facts do exist, that there are 2 spirits, one being more intelligent than the other. And there shall be another more intelligent than they, I am the Lord thy God. I am more intelligent than they all. It's hard for English majors to write great poetry because, for the most part, they're taught literary history, not literary criticism. Or if they're taught the latter, it's usually by professors who seldom or never write verse. In these relativistic and poetically correct times, it's difficult, even dangerous, for students to champion certain styles or poets when those poets are out of favor with professors in power. If you're Christian or logical, look out. If you want to write great verse, you must think clearly about your craft. You must be brave enough to take the unfashionable position that certain poets write and think better than others, and make them your mentors. Objectively, Wallace Stevens is likely a better poet than Robert Frost. It's a close call. But Ben Jonson is surely better than them both. Alas, if we could objectively evaluate every poem ever written, one would top the list. I ran into that situation. The professor who felt I was old-fashioned at the University of Washington in 1976. And he felt that one way or another, I was just not going to find much of an audience for my poetry because it was old-fashioned. And I was unabashedly writing about faith. So Bob, as with that as a lead-in, goes on in Bunkhouse Poetics 10, which has as an epitaph this: and it is not always face, clothes, or fortune gives the grace, or the feature, or the youth, but the language and the truth, with the ardor and the passion, gives the lover weight and fashion. That's from Ben Jonson, the poem His Excuse for Loving. And this is Bob's poem. Writing poetry is always, always about love, even if it's only the love of writing it. And even if you think these poems on poetics are total bunk, you can still learn to write good verse if you're passionate enough about it. Desire, love, imitation of the best poets, and practice, not hundreds of poems, more like 100 hours on the right poem. These are the keys to writing great poetry. Genius is the result of infinite pains. Excuse me. Sorry, but you'll be lucky if in your life you write 5 fine poems. Not only that, but for the most part, your stuff will be unread, misunderstood, and unappreciated. Writing poems is solitary, read lonely activity. Why people do it is a mystery you'll have to explain to yourself. Partly, it's our passion for a greater awareness of what it means to be alive, an awareness that comes in a special way through beautiful, insightful verse. Now you will notice that Bob managed to slip in a pun in there. But these two poems and their sincerity are typical of the entire sequence of Bunkhouse Poetics. And as I say, the 10 poems are scattered throughout Saviors on Mount Disneyland. So if you want to read them in their native setting, you have to buy the book. I recommend that you buy the book. I recommend that you buy all of Bob's books and support one of the best Mormon poets we've ever had. And especially support this sequence of poems in which Bob speaks about as sincerely as he has ever managed to do on any topic without puns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis and Harlow. Let me say one thing about these two boys. They've always been so kind to me. I knew their father, Marden, when he was a professor of English at BYU, and we went a couple of rounds in dialogue over whether art and religion were compatible. And you can probably imagine which side I was on. But I think Marden, their father, bested me in these arguments. At any rate, I was a little jealous of Marden because my first wife thought he was the best professor she ever had at BYU. And that made me a little bit jealous. But anyway, I loved their father. I love his boys. And their love of my work is very gratefully acknowledged here.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you much.
Okay.
Yep.
So Bob, would you like to give your remarks now?
Well, how much time do we have? No, I mean, I'll keep this as short as possible. I can cut out a little bit because I've already said something. But if we're coming to the close, this is good. I think everybody's going to need a potty break pretty soon and so on. But I want to thank everybody, Andrew and all the panelists, everyone who's spoken. Can you hear me good? Can you hear me? Am I coming through?
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Loud and clear.
There's lots of more important things going on in the world today. So this has been a bit of a distraction, certainly a luxury. Our main concern and our prayers right now should be with those who are serving and suffering on the front lines during this pandemic. I pray for them daily, and I urge you to do the same. Now I will speak a bit about myself, and I promise to keep this as short as possible, but there may be some information here that's useful. I was born on July 12, 1939 in Pasadena, California. I'm a Cancer, a moon child, a water sign, and a member of the silent generation. My mom's people were from Pittsburgh, were coffin makers in the Pittsburgh area. And on the other side, Kansas City, Missouri people who worked as typesetters for the Kansas City Star newspaper, and in California for the telephone company. Mom was born in the orange groves of Anaheim, California in the fall of 1918, which was a safe place to be during that worldwide Spanish influenza pandemic. My father was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1917, and thankfully for me, he also survived the pandemic. Dad's grandfather was born in the village of Battle, near the 1066 battlefield, by the way, in East Sussex, England. He went AWOL from the British Navy in Nova Scotia, married an Irish woman, Agnes Murphy, there, fathered my grandfather Christmas there, and one day put his family on the boat to Boston and never looked back. Grandpa Christmas claimed to the end of his life that he was born in Boston, but his grandson, the Mormon, got hold of his marriage certificate where he told the truth. It was Nova Scotia. Dad's other grandpa was Jewish from Bavaria. My dad. My great-great-grandmother on my father's side was Regina Guggenheim, a Swiss Jewess born in one of the two little villages in Switzerland north of Bern, where Jews in the early 19th century were permitted to live, the only places in Switzerland where they were permitted to live. They weren't even allowed to bury their dead on Swiss soil, so they had to bury them on an island in the Rhine River. My family was in the trucking business in Southern California. I began working in that business when I was 12 and was taught to be an expert packer and loader by my father and the teamsters I worked with over many years. Great men that I came to admire and deeply love, even though my grandfather resented having to pay them wages that enabled them to buy houses and raise families. My heart, even now, goes out to the working folks of America, in part because I am still one of them. I'm a professional driver, and I still work full-time now for Uber Technologies, delivering Uber Eats to folks and families stuck at home. A few years ago, Family Search notified me that because of my New England roots, the prophet Joseph Smith is my fourth cousin, only 6 families back. They also told me that I am a Mayflower descendant, along with millions of other Americans, from Edward Winslow. And recently, Ancestry.com hit the nail on the head by telling me what I already knew, that I am a 12.5% Jew. The rest of me is Ephraim, according to my Mormon patriarchal blessing. I attended Pasadena City Schools, where I was student body president at both my junior high and high schools, and quarterback on a couple of JV football teams, because I was such a little squirt. Once I got to play on our home field, the famous Rose Bowl, under the lights before a lot of people. I tossed a touchdown pass that night from the 25-yard line at the south end of the field to my wide receiver, Tommy Artman. It was a Hail Mary because I was about to get sacked. Jim, were you there that night? I don't know.
I must have been.
Jim might have been there. He was a great baseball player at Pasadena High. I have lots of interesting friends in my life. One of them's here, my 6th grade buddy, Doug Cox. Played the guitar. He was wild about music. In the 6th grade, we formed a duo and played Woody Guthrie and Weaver songs to what I now suspect were commie front groups in the late 40s. His family was pretty far left, to say the least, but my family didn't know about that, so they let me spend weekends with the Coxes, and I loved his family. Oh my gosh, they were so wonderful. Doug ended up going into the music business. He met Elvis and the Beatles. He had a top 10 hit, as I've said before, for Bobby Goldsboro, called A Butterfly for Bucky. You can get it on YouTube Music still. And he also sang the title song for the movie, If It's Tuesday, This Must Be Belgium, under his singing name, which was J.P. Rags. Today, he's a great motivational speaker and has been for many years. My high school friend sitting right here is James Mcmichael. And I went back, I think I went over this about Jim. There's just no, we go back so far and so great. He's really like, now I'm going to add one thing to Jim here. Jim and I were born in the same hospital in Pasadena, exactly 1 week apart, and our mothers met each other there. Mom remembered Jim as baby Mcmichael from that time on, and Jim, and when they met, when we were 16, we didn't meet again till we were 16, and when they met, he loved, that's the first thing was out of her mouth. baby Mcmichael. And Jim treasured and loved my mom for that, because he lost his own mom to cancer when he was 12. Anyway, Jim's like a brother as well as a friend, but on my birthday, I always remind him that I'm
You're
the
older.
What?
You're older.
Yeah, on that day I'm older, but I'm the oldest. Speaking of my brothers now, we'll go on to my own brother, David Christmas. He was a song and dance man in New York. He co-starred with Bernadette Peters in the musical drama Dames at Sea, made the original cast album, and was on 42nd Street, was in many other shows, and even directed Dames at Sea in later years. In later years, my brother David worked for a thing called God's Love We Deliver in California, God's Love We Deliver in New York, delivering thousands of meals every year to AIDS sufferers. He's in Texas now, being cared for by one of my magnificent daughters, who's a nurse. He is a cancer patient, and he could use a prayer. Bob Rees. We've already been over that, about how Bob Rees made my songwriting career possible. American popular music, what is called the Great American Songbook, has been a gigantic part of my life, in a way even more so than writing fiction or poetry, which my dad was a baritone with perfect pitch who could sight read the Messiah, which he sang with this or that choir nearly every year. He also belonged to a barbershop quartet called the Harmonaires. Their nickname was the Uncalled For. The families of the members of this quartet attended all the rehearsals, and us kids would be put into strange beds, but we seldom slept. Instead, we would listen to The Fireman's Bride, She Won't Stay Home by Her Fireside, and Coney Island Baby, Goodbye, My Coney Island Baby, farewell, my own true love, my honey. Anyway, until we listened to these songs, until the love of American music sank deep into our bones. And then Jim Mcmichael made me lie down on the floor of his room, or maybe I think he laid on the floor, I laid on his bed. He made me lie down on the floor and listen to Charlie Parker in the dark until I got it. And that took a while. Now, here we go. Dennis talked about love and all of that stuff. Speaking of love, reminds me that I was loved into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by a young woman so special and central to my early life that I can hardly to this day speak of her without weeping, but I will try to go on. Her name is so sacred to me that I cannot bear even to say it. Nothing other than the love of this teenager from Provo, Utah, could have reached this high school senior who hadn't dated for 2 years after his 10th grade girlfriend broke up with him, and who had lapsed into addictions and cynicism. Her love shattered my veneer of pseudo high school success and revealed me to myself as a child of God in deep need of repentance. But then, after a few months as a member of the church, I broke up with her because in my pride, I thought I could go it alone in the gospel. Of course, I was wrong. And I went wrong after that for years and years. And even my dear Carol Christmas said I should have married that gal. We did try to hook up off and on during the years following, even when one or the other of us was married to somebody else, but it never worked out. Then I lost track of her totally for many years. But last year, I found her, and we spoke on the telephone briefly. She was in assisted living, suffering from dementia, and all she could remember was that once, quote, we had gone together. A month or so later, she passed away. I will never, ever forget her. My parents let me get baptized, but they weren't all excited about it. My mom came to my baptism and sat in the front row and cried as I stood there in the baptismal font. At that time, I would have had to wait until I was 21 to go on a mission. So I didn't go, and I regretted it for years. Until this person, Christmas Carol, came along, and we served on 5 missions together. 2 at Camorra with our whole tribe of 9 as actor missionaries, 2 full-time in Europe, in Switzerland and Belgium, and 1 full-time in SoCal, where we served for a time in one of our old home wards. I've joked that there were a few who made the sign of the cross when we came into the sacrament meeting wearing our name tags. We ended up in Europe because, as the young missionaries would joke, I speak franglais, a sometimes awkward mix of French and English. I am close, but not that close to fluent. But I spent at least 30 years off and on translating a long poem by Paul Valéry into English. My full-time missions for the church were a magical time in my spiritual life and enrich my testimony of the restored gospel to this day. I also think it's time to declare that all of the women in my life have been marvelous. As far as I'm concerned, I was the guy that from time to time was not so marvelous, and I have divorces to prove it. But the years I spent with these amazing ladies were, to quote a phrase from Melville, quote, my Yale College and my Harvard. We accomplished so much together that our failures were nothing by comparison. It was like we were living in Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, quote, where the women are strong, the men are good looking, okay, that's a stretch, and all the children are above average. That last is so true. All my 11 children, stepchildren, and 35 grandchildren are rock stars. And now the Lord has sent me this person, Kate Kirkham. And it all started with an Uber pickup ride. Another mysterious way God has for hooking people up. And we've gone on lovingly from there and plan to marry by her choice on Bastille Day in July, which is appropriate because Kate is at present in durance vile in her assisted living facility with no end in sight. But as they said in Paris back in the long ago, quote, after the revolution, things will be different. And on Bastille Day, we will allow our families to, quote, eat cake. Kate is a retired professor of organizational behavior at the BYU Business Department. She has a PhD and writes poetry, and we discovered early on that we liked the same brand of ice cream, Cherry Garcia. This being the case, there's no way we won't be happy. One of our favorite songs is Bonnie Raitt's Let's Give 'Em Something to Talk About, a little mystery to figure out. I think that should be the theme song of my entire career as a Mormon writer. Let's give 'em something to talk about, a little mystery to figure out, talking about love. I can't do it very well, but anyway, thanks for your patience, everyone. I've had a good time, but thanks for attending, and thanks for the award. It means a lot to a grandpa here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you
Thanks,
everyone for
Andrew.
participating.
Yeah, it's good to hear you sing, Bob. Puts the lie to your protestations.
Hey, I got songs in Nashville right now. I got the musical moving around. Who knows what's going to happen? You know, I could maybe make it as a one-hit wonder. I'd still try to catch up with Doug here. I'm still far
Yeah,
behind.